No one on Maple Glen Drive ever imagined that the old man everyone respected would become the center of a nightmare that made an entire neighborhood hold its breath. For years, Silas Boone had been known as the quiet grandfather who walked slowly to the mailbox every morning, trimmed the hedges on Saturdays, and devoted his life to caring for his 9-year-old granddaughter, Nyla Boone, after her parents' marriage collapsed. From the outside, his life looked painfully simple and almost noble, the life of a tired American grandfather in a quiet suburb of Ohio who had given up his peace to protect a child. That was exactly why what happened next struck like lightning. The suspicion did not begin with a scream, or a broken door, or a call for help. It began with one frozen moment behind a half-open window, a moment so disturbing that it burned itself into the mind of the woman across the street and refused to leave. That woman was Maren Whitlock, a widow in her 60s who had lived on the same block long enough to know the rhythm of every house around her. She knew when the Miller boys missed the school bus, when the Henderson dog got loose, when delivery trucks passed, and when little Nyla usually played outside near the patchy front lawn in front of Silas's house. Maren had watched that child grow quieter over the past year, but she had never questioned why. In her mind, divorce often left children sad, and old Silas, though stern and awkward, still seemed like a man doing his best. He never smiled much, never chatted long, and never invited anyone inside, but plenty of decent people in America lived that way. Reserved did not mean cruel. Strange did not mean dangerous. At least that was what Maren believed until the autumn afternoon when everything changed. The air that day had the first true chill of the season. Dry leaves scraped along the sidewalk, the sky had gone pale and thin, and Maren sat near her living room window with a basket of sewing in her lap, half watching television, half enjoying the quiet. Her curtain was slightly open, just enough for her to glance across the street the way she always did out of habit, not curiosity. That glance lasted only a second, but it turned her blood cold. Inside Silas Boone's house, in a narrow room lit by slanting afternoon sunlight, little Nyla was on the floor. She was not playing. She was not reading. She was pressed against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, shoulders tight, face pale, and tears streaming down both cheeks. Her eyes were wide in a way no child's eyes should ever be. In front of her stood Silas. His back was partly turned, but one arm was raised, and in that hand something metallic flashed in the light. It looked like a knife. Maren did not breathe. Her needle slipped from her fingers and vanished into the carpet, but she never noticed. All her attention locked onto that single horrifying scene. Nyla looked frozen, as if terror had drained all movement from her body. Silas stood over her, rigid and severe, the kind of stillness that felt more threatening than shouting. Maren leaned closer to the glass, her pulse pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The object in his hand caught the light again. A kitchen knife. That was what her mind told her. A real knife in the hand of an old man standing above a crying child. Her chest tightened so sharply it hurt. Every instinct screamed that she was witnessing the beginning of something irreversible. She jerked back from the window as though the sight itself might reach through the glass and touch her. For several seconds she crouched beneath the curtain, trembling, one hand pressed over her mouth, trying to understand what she had seen. She told herself there had to be another explanation. Maybe he had been cutting fruit. Maybe Nyla had fallen and was crying for some harmless reason. Maybe the angle had deceived her. But those excuses died the moment she remembered the child's face. That face was not the face of a girl upset over homework or punishment. It was the face of someone afraid of what might happen next. Maren had seen fear before. She had seen it in emergency rooms, at funerals, on the faces of women packing bags in the middle of the night. This was that kind of fear. Raw, silent, and real. From that moment, peace vanished from Maple Glen Drive, though no one else knew it yet. Maren tried to resume her normal evening, but the image stalked her from room to room. She could not focus on dinner, could not finish her sewing, could not even hear the television clearly. Again and again she saw Nyla's tearful eyes and the hard line of Silas Boone's shoulders. By bedtime she had convinced herself that doing nothing would be a form of cowardice. Yet calling the police on a respected grandfather without proof felt reckless, almost unthinkable. What if she was wrong? In a neighborhood like theirs, accusations spread fast and never fully disappeared. One false move could destroy what remained of a family already struggling. But another thought cut even deeper. What if she was right, and hesitation gave danger more time? Over the next few days, Maren watched carefully. That was when the ordinary little details began to pile up into something darker. Nyla stopped appearing outside. No bicycle in the driveway. No small figure on the sidewalk. No laugh, no movement, no sign of a child living in that house. The curtains remained shut morning to night, thick and sealed as if the home itself wanted to keep the world out. Silas came and went alone, always calm, always neat, always carrying on as though nothing inside those walls had changed. That calm unnerved Maren even more. It did not feel natural. It felt practiced. It felt like someone guarding a secret. Trying to test what she feared, Maren baked a small vanilla loaf cake, the sort of simple neighborly gesture no one could refuse without seeming rude. She walked across the street with the warm dish in her hands and forced herself to smile when Silas answered the door. Up close, he looked exactly as he always did: clean flannel shirt, silver hair combed back, expression controlled, voice even. Nothing in his face resembled the raging figure her imagination had built at night. That almost made it worse. Men who frightened children were not supposed to look so composed. Maren handed over the cake and casually mentioned that she had not seen Nyla outside lately. Silas answered that the girl had been feeling under the weather and was resting inside. The explanation landed softly, smoothly, and would have satisfied almost anyone else. But Maren studied his eyes and found nothing there she could trust. He thanked her, nodded once, and closed the door before she could see past him into the house. She returned home with a heavier heart than before. A sick child could still wave through a window. A child with a mild cold could still step onto the porch for fresh air. But Nyla had vanished completely, and the house looked less like a home than a sealed box. That afternoon, just when Maren had almost convinced herself to wait one more day, she spotted movement outside. Nyla emerged briefly near the side yard. Maren rose so fast from her chair that it scraped against the floor. She called out with as much warmth as she could manage, hoping the girl might come closer, hoping for one clear look, one reassuring sign that would end this torment. Nyla stopped for only a second. She turned her head just enough for Maren to see her face, and that face destroyed the last of Maren's doubt. The child looked pale, withdrawn, and deeply afraid. Instead of approaching, she lowered her gaze and hurried away, almost as if speaking to a neighbor had become dangerous. That night Maren opened an old spiral notebook and began writing down every detail she could remember. The date. The closed curtains. The missing days. The way Nyla avoided eye contact. The frozen terror in her face. Once she started, she could not stop. Something in her told her these details mattered, that the truth was hidden not in one shocking scene but in the pattern around it. She wrote until her hand cramped, then sat staring at the page, listening to the quiet hum of her refrigerator and the distant rumble of traffic far beyond the neighborhood. For the first time, the silence on the block no longer felt peaceful. It felt dangerous. The next morning she rose early and took her place on the porch with a mug of tea, pretending to enjoy the cool weather while actually keeping her full attention fixed on Silas Boone's house. The curtains were still closed. No school backpack appeared. No child came to the window. No light turned on in the front room. Even the front yard looked abandoned, the way houses look when families leave for vacation, except Silas's truck was still there. As the hours crawled by, Marin's unease hardened into conviction. Something was wrong inside that house, and whatever it was getting worse. Then came the moment that pushed fear into obsession. Near mid-morning, from the narrow side alley behind the Boone house, Marin caught a glimpse of a small figure moving too fast and too unsteadily. It was Nyla. The child wore a lavender sweater Marin recognized immediately, but her hair was messy, her posture hunched, and her steps looked unbalanced, as though she had either fallen, been shoved, or had not slept in days. Before Marin could call out, the girl disappeared behind the fence line. The image lasted only seconds, but it confirmed everything Marin dreaded. This was no harmless family problem. This was a child unraveling in plain sight while the adults around her kept making excuses. From there, Marin's thoughts became a storm she could no longer calm. Every closed curtain became a warning. Every nighttime shadow around Silas's dark windows felt loaded with meaning. She began listening for sounds, studying patterns, replaying the original image in her mind until it sharpened instead of fading. She did not yet know whether Silas Boone was an abuser, a liar, a desperate old man, or something even more unsettling. She only knew one thing with certainty: behind those walls, little Nyla Boone was living in fear, and if no one acted soon, the quiet suburban street everyone trusted might become the backdrop to a tragedy no one would ever forgive themselves for missing. And so, while the rest of Maple Glen Drive slept under the false comfort of porch lights and trimmed lawns, Marin Whitlock made a decision that would pull hidden terror out into the open. She would keep watching. She would keep recording. She would not let that child disappear into silence. Because sometimes the most frightening danger is not the evil everyone can see. It is the evil hidden behind a familiar door, protected by routine, politeness, and the terrible human habit of assuming everything is fine until it is too late. From the moment Marin Whitlock chose not to ignore what she had seen, her world narrowed into a single, relentless focus. The quiet routine of Maple Glen Drive no longer felt comforting, it felt deceptive. Every trimmed lawn, every parked car, every polite wave from passing neighbors became part of a fragile illusion that only she seemed to see through. Behind that illusion stood Silas Boone's house, silent, sealed, and increasingly impossible to ignore. What disturbed her most was not just the image she had witnessed, but the unnatural stillness that followed it. It was the kind of stillness that suggested control, as if every sound, every movement inside that home was being carefully managed. Marin stopped trusting coincidence. She began tracking patterns. Each morning she positioned herself where she could observe without being obvious, a cup of coffee in hand, her eyes fixed across the street. Silas moved with the same measured calm he always had, stepping out briefly, returning with groceries, closing the door with quiet precision. Nothing in his behavior outwardly confirmed her fears, yet that was exactly what made it worse. There was no visible chaos, no sign of struggle, no raised voice, no broken window. If something terrible was happening inside, it was happening in complete control, hidden behind discipline and routine. What truly unsettled her was Nyla's absence. Days passed without the child appearing. No school bus stop, no bike rides, no small figure lingering near the yard. For a neighborhood where children were usually visible and loud, her disappearance created a void that felt unnatural. Marin began to notice how easily others dismissed it. A child staying inside for a few days raised no alarm to anyone else. But to her, the absence felt deliberate, like someone had erased the girl from view. Her concern deepened into urgency when she saw Nyla again, but only briefly, and not in a way that offered relief. The girl moved quickly along the side of the house, unsteady, almost disoriented. Her posture lacked the natural energy of a child. It looked as if she was trying not to be seen, not just by Marin, but by the world itself. That fleeting image carried more weight than any scream could have. It suggested fear that had been internalized, controlled, and forced into silence. Marin's instincts hardened into action. She began documenting everything. Times, movements, changes in lighting. She wrote down each detail with increasing precision, as if building a case only she understood. The act of writing became her anchor, the only way to keep her thoughts from spiraling. Yet the more she documented, the clearer the pattern became. The house was not simply quiet. It was contained. Windows remained covered at all hours. Lights appeared only briefly at night, then vanished. The rhythm of the home did not match a normal life. It resembled something concealed. Sleep became difficult. Nights stretched long as Marin found herself listening for sounds that might confirm what she feared. The neighborhood, once filled with distant traffic and the occasional barking dog, now seemed unnaturally still. That silence amplified every small noise. A shifting curtain. A faint thud. The possibility of movement behind walls she could not see through. Her imagination no longer felt like imagination. It felt like anticipation. Then came the first real escalation. Late one night, unable to rest, Marin noticed movement where there should have been none. A dim light flickered inside Silas's house, just enough to create shadows against the curtain. A figure passed by, slow and deliberate, holding something long in one hand. The shape was unclear, but it was not ordinary. It lingered for only a moment before disappearing, and then the light vanished entirely, plunging the house back into darkness as if nothing had happened. That brief moment shattered any remaining doubt. Marin no longer questioned whether something was wrong. She knew it was. The question had changed. It was no longer about suspicion. It was about understanding the nature of the danger and how far it had already gone. The next morning, her concern turned into urgency she could no longer contain alone. She reached out to people who might have noticed something similar, hoping to confirm that she was not the only one sensing it. The responses she received only made things worse. Others had also noticed Nyla's absence. Some had heard small inconsistencies in Silas's explanations. But none of them had seen what Marin had seen. None of them carried the same certainty. To them, it was unusual. To her, it was alarming. Realizing that observation alone was no longer enough, Marin made a decision that crossed a line she had never imagined crossing. If no one would believe her words, she needed something undeniable. Something that could not be dismissed as worry or imagination. She needed proof. That decision changed everything. It meant stepping beyond passive concern into active surveillance, into a space where fear and responsibility blurred together. With the help of someone she trusted, she arranged a way to capture what was happening inside that house, even if only from a distance. The device was small, hidden carefully, positioned with precision toward the one place that mattered most, the window where she had first seen Nyla in fear. It was a risk, one that could expose her actions if discovered, but the alternative felt worse. Doing nothing now felt like participation in whatever was happening behind those walls. That night, Marin sat alone, her attention locked onto a screen that showed only darkness at first. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching longer than the last. The stillness returned, almost mocking her effort. For a moment, doubt crept back in, whispering that perhaps she had gone too far, that perhaps there would be nothing to see. Then, just past midnight, something changed. The curtain shifted. A faint light appeared inside. And in that dim, suffocating glow, the outline of a small figure emerged again. Nyla. She was sitting on the floor exactly as Marin had seen before, knees pulled tightly to her chest, her body trembling in a way that could not be mistaken for anything but fear. There was no visible injury, no obvious violence, but the terror radiating from her posture was unmistakable. It was the kind of fear that existed even in silence, the kind that suggested something unseen was approaching. What made it even more disturbing was what wasn't there. Silas Boone was nowhere in sight. For a brief moment, it looked as if the child was afraid of something that hadn't yet appeared, something just outside the frame, something approaching slowly and deliberately. Then, just as suddenly as the light had come on, it disappeared again, plunging everything back into darkness. Maren froze, her breath shallow, her hands cold. This was no longer suspicion. This was evidence of something deeply wrong. And whatever was happening inside that house was only just beginning to reveal itself. The moment Maren Whitlock realized she had captured something real, something undeniable, the situation crossed a line that could no longer be reversed. Fear no longer lived only in her imagination. It now existed in recorded form, replayable, undeniable, and deeply disturbing. She watched the footage again and again, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to be certain. Each time she saw Nyla's small body trembling in that dim light, the same conclusion pressed harder against her chest. This was not a child resting, not a child recovering from a mild illness. This was a child living under constant fear, the kind that erodes the mind slowly and quietly. Sleep became impossible. Maren sat through the night, her eyes fixed on the screen, waiting for something more, something that would explain what she was seeing. Hours passed with nothing but darkness, until a faint sound finally broke through. It was subtle at first, barely more than a shift in air, but then came a clearer signal. A soft metallic click, like a lock being opened. The sound was precise, deliberate, not accidental. It was followed by slow footsteps, heavy enough to belong to an adult, moving across the floor with control rather than urgency. Maren's entire body tensed. She leaned closer, as if proximity could somehow make the sound clearer. What followed made her blood run cold. A low voice emerged, controlled and firm, carrying a weight that suggested authority, not comfort. It was the kind of voice that did not need to shout to instill fear. Immediately after, a faint, fragile sound answered it. A child's suppressed sob. Not loud, not desperate, but contained, as if the child had learned that crying openly would only make things worse. Then came a sharp crash. Glass breaking. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. For a moment, everything froze again. No movement, no additional noise, only the lingering echo of something fragile being shattered. Then footsteps moved away, faster this time, followed by the distinct slam of a door. The recording ended in silence. Maren pulled back from the screen as if it had burned her. Her breathing became uneven, her thoughts racing faster than she could control. This was no longer ambiguous. There was structure to what she had heard. Control. Fear. Isolation. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, and that picture pointed directly at Silas Boone. But even as that conclusion formed, something inside her hesitated. There was something about the sequence that did not align perfectly with what she expected. The voice had not sounded chaotic or violent. It had sounded controlled, almost restrained. The fear in Nyla had been absolute, but the interaction itself lacked the explosive aggression typically associated with abuse. Instead, it felt like something more calculated, something that relied on pressure rather than force. That contradiction did not comfort her. It made the situation more unsettling. By morning, Maren had reached a decision she could no longer delay. This was no longer something she could handle alone. The evidence she had gathered needed to be placed in the hands of someone directly connected to the child. Someone who could act without hesitation. Someone who had the right to intervene. That person was Isla Boone, Nyla's mother. Reaching out was not easy. Maren knew that what she was about to present could shatter a family, could destroy trust, could force a daughter to question her own father. But the alternative was worse. Silence would protect no one. When Isla finally received the information, the reaction was immediate and complex. Shock came first, followed by disbelief, and then a creeping fear that grew as the evidence unfolded. The recordings, the observations, the patterns. None of it could be easily dismissed. Yet accepting it meant accepting that the man who had raised her, the man she had trusted with her child, might be capable of something unthinkable. That internal conflict slowed her response, but it did not stop it. Maren pushed harder, driven by urgency. Time felt like an enemy now. Every hour that passed was another hour Nyla remained inside that house. Another hour of fear. Another hour of damage that could not be undone. Eventually, hesitation gave way to action. Plans were made quickly. There would be no warning, no phone call, no chance for Silas to prepare or hide anything. The truth would be uncovered directly, in person, without delay. Maren insisted on being there, not out of curiosity, but out of responsibility. She had started this. She would see it through. The afternoon they chose felt heavy from the start. The air seemed thicker, the light dimmer, as if the entire street sensed something about to break. As they approached the house, every step felt louder than it should have. The silence around them was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. When the door finally opened, Silas Boone stood there exactly as he always had. Calm. Composed. Unreadable. There was no panic in his expression, no visible sign that anything was wrong. That alone sent a chill through Maren. If he had something to hide, he was hiding it well. Too well. But this time, they did not accept distance. They moved inside. The interior of the house felt wrong immediately. Not chaotic, not dirty, not obviously neglected, but wrong in a subtler way. The air carried a faint chemical scent, something sterile, something that did not belong in a normal home. The silence inside was heavier than outside, pressing in from all sides. They moved quickly toward the room that mattered most. The door was locked. That single detail confirmed everything Maren feared. A child's room, locked from the outside. No explanation could justify that. The key was found, hands trembling as it turned in the lock. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a darkness that felt deeper than it should have been. The windows were sealed, covered so completely that no natural light could enter. The air inside was stale, thick, difficult to breathe. And in the corner of that room, barely illuminated by a weak lamp, was Nyla. She was smaller than Maren remembered. Tinna. Her body curled tightly into itself, as if trying to disappear. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale, her eyes distant. She did not react immediately to the door opening. It was as if the outside world had become something foreign to her, something she no longer trusted. The sight hit harder than anything Maren had imagined. This was not just fear. This was damage. Deep, prolonged, invisible damage. Behind them, Silas Boone entered the room, still calm, still composed, still refusing to match the horror of the scene with any visible emotion. And in that moment, as all eyes turned toward him, the tension reached a breaking point. Because now there was no more guessing. No more watching from a distance. Only the truth remained. And whatever that truth was, it was about to change everything. The moment Nyla Boone was lifted out of that suffocating room, everything accelerated, as if the truth itself could no longer tolerate being hidden. The fragile body in Isla's arms felt far too light, almost weightless, like something that had been slowly fading rather than living. Her skin was pale, her breathing shallow, her eyes unfocused as though her mind had retreated somewhere distant where fear could not reach her anymore. Maren followed close behind, her chest tight with a mixture of dread and urgency, knowing that whatever had been happening inside that house had already gone too far. The drive to the clinic blurred into a sequence of sharp, disconnected moments. Doors opening. Medical staff rushing forward. White lights replacing darkness. The quiet suburban nightmare was suddenly exposed to clinical reality. Doctors moved quickly, their expressions tightening as they assessed the child's condition. There were no dramatic injuries, no visible wounds that would immediately explain the terror she had endured. Instead, there was something far more unsettling. Signs of prolonged neglect. Severe fatigue. Psychological withdrawal so deep that it looked like the child had sealed herself away from the world. Marin stood to the side watching, her hands trembling slightly. She had expected something horrible, but not this kind of emptiness. It was not chaos. It was erosion. Something had been slowly draining the life out of that child, day by day, without leaving obvious marks. That realization was more disturbing than anything violent could have been. It meant whatever had caused this had been happening for a long time. As the examination continued, new details began to surface, each one complicating the situation further. There were irregular marks on Nyla's body, not clearly from direct harm, but not entirely explainable either. Her physical condition suggested malnutrition, but not complete starvation. It was controlled, as if someone had been limiting her, not abandoning her. That distinction mattered, and it introduced a possibility Marin had not fully considered before. Silas Boone had not lost control. He had maintained it. And that made everything more confusing. A psychological evaluation added another layer. Nyla did not respond normally to people entering the room, especially men. Her body reacted instantly, shrinking inward, as if expecting something to happen. But when left alone with her mother, her breathing steadied slightly, her posture softened just enough to suggest that not all trust had been destroyed. This pattern did not fully match the narrative Marin had built in her mind. It suggested fear, yes, but fear with a specific trigger, not generalized terror toward everyone. That contradiction began to fracture the certainty Marin had carried for days. While medical staff continued their work, Isla remained close to her daughter, her face drawn with exhaustion and guilt. The weight of what she was realizing pressed heavily on her. The man she had trusted, the man who had raised her, now stood at the center of something she could no longer easily define. Every explanation she had believed was now under pressure, cracking under the weight of evidence that did not fully align. Meanwhile, outside the hospital room, the situation expanded. Authorities became involved, though not with immediate aggression. The initial report lacked the kind of clear, undeniable evidence that forced instant action. There were signs of concern, yes, but also ambiguity. That ambiguity created hesitation. Silas Boone was not immediately treated as a criminal. He was questioned, observed, but not restrained. His calm demeanor persisted, even under scrutiny, as though he believed that whatever he had done could be justified if understood correctly. That calm unsettled everyone. Marin watched him from a distance when he was brought in for questioning. There was no panic in him, no visible guilt, no defensive anger. Instead, there was something else entirely. A quiet tension, not directed outward, but inward, as if he had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was now waiting for it to finally surface. That presence forced a shift in perspective. If he were truly hiding something, he was doing it with remarkable control. But if he were not what he appeared to be, then the entire situation might be far more complex than anyone had assumed. The turning point came not from confrontation, but from information. As doctors continued their analysis, a critical detail emerged from Nyla's condition. Traces of a sedative substance were found in her system. Not in a dangerous overdose, but in repeated, controlled amounts. The kind of substance that could dull fear, suppress panic, and force sleep when the mind refused to rest. It was not something a child would access on her own. It had been given to her intentionally, over time. That discovery hit with enormous weight. It confirmed that someone had been intervening directly in her physical and psychological state. The immediate suspicion pointed, once again, to Silas. But even then, something did not fully align. If his goal had been to harm, the pattern would have looked different. The dosage, the timing, the lack of escalation all suggested something else. Not cruelty, but desperation. Not chaos, but a misguided attempt at control. Still, that did not excuse what had been done. It only made the motive harder to define. At the same time, new testimonies began to surface from the neighborhood. Small observations, previously dismissed, now carried new weight. Late-night movements near the Boone property. Unfamiliar figures seen briefly and then gone. A sense of being watched that some neighbors had brushed aside as imagination. One elderly man recalled seeing Silas outside in the middle of the night, scanning the yard with a flashlight, as if searching for something that wasn't supposed to be there. That detail shifted the narrative again. It introduced a new possibility. What if the danger had not been entirely inside the house? What if something outside had triggered everything? As this possibility began to take shape, Maren felt the ground beneath her certainty begin to shift. The image she had built in her mind, of a grandfather as the sole source of fear, no longer fit perfectly with the emerging pattern. There were gaps, inconsistencies, pieces that suggested a second presence, something unseen but influential. The most disturbing part was that Nyla, even in her fragile state, reacted strongly to one specific idea. The presence of someone outside. Not just outside the hospital room. Outside the house. That reaction planted a seed of doubt that grew rapidly. Maren began to reconsider everything she had seen. The knife. The locked door. The sealed windows. What if those actions, as terrifying as they looked, had not been meant to harm, but to protect? What if Silas had been responding to something no one else had taken seriously? The thought was unsettling, because it meant her original conclusion might have been incomplete. And if it was incomplete, then the real danger might still be out there. Unseen. Watching. Waiting. That realization changed the stakes entirely. Because if the threat had not been fully contained, then Nyla was not the only one at risk. And whatever had driven Silas Boone to such extreme measures had not yet been fully revealed. The truth was still unfolding. And it was far more dangerous than anyone had first believed. The moment the investigation shifted away from a single suspect and began to widen outward, everything that once seemed certain started to rearrange itself into a far more dangerous picture. What had initially looked like a closed, isolated case of possible abuse inside one house now began to stretch beyond its walls, creeping into the surrounding streets, into the shadows no one had been paying attention to. The tension did not ease. It sharpened. Evidence recovered from Silas Boone's property became the first key to unlocking that hidden layer. What investigators found was not the chaotic environment of a violent man, but something structured, deliberate, and deeply unsettling in a different way. Hidden microphones. Carefully placed recording devices. Cameras positioned not to monitor the child, but to watch the perimeter of the house. The setup was not random. It was defensive. Every angle suggested that Silas had been trying to track movement outside, not inside. That discovery alone forced a complete re-evaluation. The recordings he had collected were reviewed, and within them lay fragments of something no one had expected to find. Repeated patterns of faint movement beyond the fence line. Footsteps that did not belong to anyone in the household. Shadows appearing briefly at the edge of the property before disappearing again. At first, these details seemed insignificant, easy to dismiss as environmental noise or coincidence. But as more footage was analyzed, the pattern became undeniable. Someone had been watching the house. Not once. Not twice. But repeatedly. The realization sent a ripple through everyone involved. What had been interpreted as paranoia now began to look like vigilance. Silas Boone had not been imagining things. He had been observing something real, something persistent, something that had remained just out of reach of proof until now. The situation escalated quickly from there. A deeper search of the neighborhood revealed more inconsistencies. Reports that had once been brushed aside were now revisited with urgency. A tall, thin man seen walking late at night near the end of the street. Unfamiliar movement near backyards. A presence that never stayed long enough to be confronted, but appeared often enough to leave a lingering sense of unease. None of these reports had been taken seriously on their own. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The breakthrough came when footage from Silas's hidden devices was synchronized with new surveillance data gathered by authorities. One frame, slightly blurred but clear enough, captured a figure near the fence. The posture, the height, the timing. It aligned perfectly with the earlier reports. For the first time, the invisible presence took on a physical form. A man. Watching. Waiting. Moving carefully to avoid detection. That image changed everything. Investigators traced the movement patterns, mapping the times and locations where the figure had appeared. The path led to a house at the far end of Maple Glen Drive, a place that had blended into the neighborhood without drawing attention. It belonged to a man named Garrett Voss, a recent arrival whose past had not been closely examined by anyone around him. Once his name entered the investigation, the pace intensified. Authorities moved quickly, securing access to his property. What they found inside erased any remaining doubt and replaced it with something far darker. The interior of the house was not chaotic, not overtly violent, but meticulously organized in a way that revealed obsession. Walls covered with images. Not random images, but targeted ones. Children from the neighborhood. Taken at a distance. Taken without awareness. Taken over time. Among them, one face appeared more frequently than the others. Nyla Boone. Dozens of photographs captured her routine. Walking to school. Playing outside. Standing near the yard. Each image marked, studied, categorized. Notes written beside them. Times. Locations. Patterns. It was not impulsive behavior. It was calculated. Planned. Controlled. The deeper investigators looked, the worse it became. Hidden storage devices revealed additional files. More images. More recordings. Evidence that the surveillance extended beyond observation. Entry points had been tested. Movement inside the Boone property had been attempted. The boundary between watching and acting had already begun to blur. The truth struck with full force. Nyla had not been afraid of her grandfather. She had been afraid of someone else. Someone who had been getting closer. The timeline reconstructed itself rapidly. Weeks earlier, Nyla had encountered Garrett Voss near a local park. The interaction had been brief, but enough to trigger fear. She had reported it to the only person she trusted completely. Silas Boone. From that moment on, everything changed. Silas had recognized the threat immediately, but without concrete proof, his warnings had been dismissed. Authorities had seen no evidence. Neighbors had seen no danger. The system had failed to respond. So Silas had taken control himself. He had sealed the house. Limited Nyla's exposure to the outside. Monitored every possible entry point. Watched through the night. Installed devices. Tracked movement. He had created a barrier, not just physical, but psychological, forcing the world out to keep something worse from getting in. But in doing so, he had created another kind of damage. Nyla had been protected, but at a cost. Isolation. Fear. Confusion. The sedatives, given in small controlled amounts, had not been intended to harm, but to suppress the terror that kept her awake night after night. It was a desperate solution, chosen by a man who saw danger clearly but lacked the means to handle it properly. The tragedy was not a single act. It was a chain of decisions, each one shaped by fear, each one pushing the situation further into darkness. As authorities moved to apprehend Gerrit Voss, the tension reached its peak. Surveillance was tightened. Patrols increased. The neighborhood that had once felt safe now felt exposed. Every shadow carried weight. Every movement drew attention. Then, finally, the moment came. Gerrit Voss was spotted moving again, just as he had done so many times before, attempting to remain unseen. But this time, the pattern had been broken. He was no longer the observer. He was the target. The pursuit was swift and controlled. Escape routes closed. Movement restricted. Within minutes, the man who had haunted the edges of Maple Glen Drive was brought down restrained, and removed from the shadows he had relied on for so long. The capture did not bring immediate relief. It brought clarity. And that clarity revealed the full extent of what had almost happened. Nyla had not been trapped in a house of danger. She had been shielded from one. But the line between protection and harm had blurred so completely that no one had recognized the truth in time. By the time it was uncovered, the damage had already been done. And the realization settled heavily over everyone involved. Because sometimes, the most terrifying part of the story is not the villain hiding in the dark. It is how close that villain came to succeeding while everyone else was looking in the wrong direction. When Gerrit Voss was finally taken into custody, the tension that had gripped Maple Glen Drive for weeks did not disappear instantly. It did not dissolve into relief the way people expected. Instead, it lingered in a quieter, heavier form, settling into the spaces between people, into the silence of homes that suddenly felt less certain than before. The danger had been real, closer than anyone had understood, and that realization could not be undone. The investigation that followed confirmed everything in precise, unforgiving detail. Digital evidence, recovered files, and recorded movements established a clear pattern of stalking, surveillance, and intent. Gerrit Voss had not been acting randomly. He had been studying, planning, and waiting for the right moment to move beyond observation. The material found in his possession revealed not just interest, but escalation. What had begun as watching was already shifting toward something far more dangerous. For the neighborhood, the truth arrived as both a shock and a warning. People who had once dismissed small signs began replaying memories in their minds, connecting moments they had ignored. A stranger lingering too long. A figure passing late at night. A feeling of unease that had been explained away. All of it now carried new meaning. The illusion of safety that had defined the street was gone, replaced by a more cautious awareness that danger did not always announce itself clearly. At the center of it all stood Silas Boone. The man who had been suspected, watched, and quietly judged now faced a different kind of scrutiny. Authorities reviewed everything he had done, not with immediate condemnation, but with careful analysis. His actions existed in a complicated space between protection and violation. He had not acted with malicious intent, but he had crossed boundaries that could not be ignored. The use of sedatives, the confinement, the surveillance. Each decision carried consequences, even if they had been made under pressure and fear. In the end, the conclusion was not simple. Silas Boone was not a criminal in the way people had first imagined. The evidence showed a man responding to a threat that others had failed to recognize. A man who had seen danger clearly, reported it, and been dismissed. A man who had then taken responsibility into his own hands, not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. Yet desperation did not erase the harm caused by his methods. Protection had turned into control, and control had left its mark on the child he had tried to keep safe. That complexity defined everything that followed. Nyla Boone remained under medical care, her recovery slow and deliberate. The physical damage was manageable, but the psychological impact required time, patience, and careful guidance. She had learned to associate safety with isolation, to equate silence with survival. Rebuilding her sense of normal life meant undoing those patterns step by step. It was not a process measured in days, but in moments. Small reactions, subtle changes, the gradual return of trust. Her mother, Isla, stayed close through it all, carrying the weight of both guilt and relief. She had nearly misjudged the situation completely, had come close to believing the wrong story, and that realization stayed with her. But she also understood that the truth had not been obvious. It had been hidden behind fear, shaped by incomplete information, distorted by appearances. What mattered now was not the mistake, but what came after it. Maren Whitlock, too, faced her own reckoning. She had acted out of concern, driven by what she believed was right, and in many ways, she had been. Without her persistence, without her refusal to ignore what she saw, the truth might have remained buried much longer. But she also understood how easily perception could mislead. What she had witnessed had been real, but her interpretation had been incomplete. She had seen fear and assumed its source. She had followed instinct, but instinct alone had not revealed the full picture. That realization did not diminish her actions, but it deepened her understanding. Silas Boone returned home not as a villain, and not as a hero, but as something far more human. A man who had done what he thought was necessary, and who now had to live with the consequences of those choices. The house that had once felt sealed and oppressive began to change. Curtains opened. Light returned. The structure remained the same, but its presence shifted. It no longer felt like a place hiding something. It felt like a place trying to recover. The relationship between Silas and Nyla slowly rebuilt itself in a different form. Trust, once shaken, did not return instantly, but it was not gone. Beneath the fear, there remained something stronger. A bond formed not just by circumstance, but by intention. Nyla began to understand what had been done for her, even if she could not fully process how it had been done. Silas, in turn, learned that protection could not exist without openness, that fear could not be managed through silence alone. The neighborhood changed as well. Maple Glen Drive no longer carried the same effortless calm it once had. People paid closer attention. They listened more carefully. They questioned more. The idea that danger only existed in distant places had been replaced by a more grounded awareness. Safety was no longer assumed. It was something to be maintained, to be protected collectively, not passively. In time, the story settled into something quieter, something that no longer dominated every conversation, but never fully disappeared. It became part of the memory of the street, a reminder of how easily truth could be hidden beneath appearances, how quickly judgment could form, and how important it was to look beyond the surface. Because in the end, the most unsettling part of what had happened was not just the presence of a man like Garrett Voss. It was how close he had come. How easily he had remained unseen. And how the line between protector and suspect had blurred so completely that no one recognized the truth until it was almost too late. What remained after everything was not just relief. It was understanding. And the quiet, lasting knowledge that sometimes the difference between fear and safety is not what is visible, but what is hidden just out of sight, waiting to be noticed by someone willing to look closer.